their losses can't be sustained in Pokrovsk for too long. It may be that they will take Pokrovsk, and in any case, once they're within artillery range, which they more or less are now, they'll do to Pokrovsk what they did to Mariupol and Severodonetsk and Avdiivka and Bakhmut, that they'll shell it. They will reduce it to rubble and then take control of the rubble. That's the way they do it. And so Pokrovsk is in danger that is now the outcome. Pokrovsk was a city of about 60, 70,000 people. Now, it's said there are about 25,000 people still there. One imagines that they will get out pretty quickly. And what will be left will be the rubble as from the eastern part of the city spreading to the center and the west as the Russians move closer. That would seem to be the next stage in this process. But the Russians can overextend themselves. And indeed, if the Ukrainians can summon up more forces, that they have an opportunity as well to chop Russian forces off as they move towards Pokrovsk. So they're not out of options at all.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. Professor of Defence Studies, Michael Clarke is joining us. Mike is a former Director General of the British think tank RUSI. He's a leading defence and security analyst. We speak every week on BFBS SITREP, and his latest book, Great British Commanders, is out on the 30th of September. Mike, welcome back. Great to see you again.
Yeah, always good to be back.
We're talking in the aftermath of a series of particularly brutal aerial bombing attacks on Lviv near the Polish border in Ukraine and Poltava in central Ukraine and several other towns and cities. Do you see a pattern to where and when these attacks are now being carried out?
There is, in the sense that the air attacks are directed, as far as they're directed at targets, are at the energy infrastructure. So the Russians have been pretty successful, more so than previously, at taking down the energy infrastructure ahead of the winter. And that both has an effect on civilians and on the military, because, of course, they need electrical supplies for all sorts of things that they do. And the attacks on civilian centres too are a pattern. I mean, if you look at the big attacks of this week, are like Mariupol in March 2022, the big attack on the school in Mariupol where a lot of children were sheltering. Kramatorsk, the railway station, in April the following month in 2022, which killed a lot of people. And then January 23 last year, there was a big attack on Dnipro. And then do you remember later on in October last year, there was that attack on Hroza, which is a small village, but it was a wake. There was a lot of people gathered and they were attacked because somebody gave the coordinates of a big crowd of people. And there's no question they were attempts to kill civilians. And the attacks on Poltava this week and Lviv are also the same. Poltava did include an attack on a military communications center where the Russians said this is where drone operators are being trained, which is plausible. But they also attacked civilian buildings, not just around it, but in other parts of Poltava. Poltava is a pretty big city. And so this attempt to hit civilian centers as well as infrastructure centers is part of a pattern. And it's partly designed, I think, by the Russians to retaliate for Kursk, to show the Ukrainian people, as if they didn't know already, that Russia's anger can take a very deadly form. And so there's a degree of revenge in this, as well as a strategic design to actually make the Ukrainians fear the winter. And there may be some success in that strategy, I have to say.
Mike, you wrote an article for The Times at the weekend when you described the war in Ukraine as more dynamic and unpredictable now than at any other time in the last 18 months. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, just over 4 weeks ago now, we're into the fifth week of the incursion into Kursk, where the Ukrainians, without consulting any of their allies, at the time we wondered about this, and I looked for evidence that they'd consulted the Americans, and I couldn't find any. And it is now pretty clear that they didn't ask anybody else. They created tremendous operational security, and they suddenly went over the border on the 6th of August. And that's just over 4 weeks ago now. And that created this dynamism, because certainly it forced the Russians to move forces from other places, but not from the place where the Ukrainians would have wanted them to move forces, which is down in the south, in the Donbas, towards Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar. And if anything, it's galvanized the Russians to say, okay, if you're moving some equipment, at least, if not a lot of men, but if you're moving equipment away from the south, this is our opportunity. So the Russians have put much more into trying to take Pokrovsk. And although they're advancing very slowly towards Pokrovsk, and they're losing again, we know, over 1,000 men a day on average, which is they're losing them to dead and wounded, and they're losing a huge amount of equipment. Even this week, they've lost well over 100 armored vehicles. So they're losing, but they're grinding forward because they're without concern for losses. They're just going to take Pokrovsk. That's the view. So the war has become more dynamic than at any time since the Ukrainian offensive in the autumn of 2022. So things are moving. And they're moving towards the winter because Ukrainian climate is the seasons are very predictable. And so we know that the winter will really start from last week of October, first week of November, when movement will become more difficult. It'll get cold, then it'll get wet. Well, get wet and then it'll get cold. And so big offensives become not impossible, but much more difficult in those circumstances. So both sides are playing for advantage before the winter sets in, which means between now and the end of October. So we are seeing more movement, and I think we will see more territories change hands, both in Kursk and possibly in the south.
When the Kursk offensive was launched, it was unclear whether it would be a short raid or not. And you said if it lasted a week, it would be significant. You described the intention to divert Russian troops away from the offensive and the march towards Pokrovsk. Is there a strategic interest beyond that for Ukraine? And how significant is it?
Yeah, I mean, the Ukrainians want to achieve several things by this Kursk offensive, and it may be they don't entirely know what they want to achieve from it. Militarily, it will only be judged a success if it removes Russian forces from the south, around Pokrovsk, Chasiv Yar, and stops the Russians taking the whole of the Donbas in an offensive probably next spring, not during the winter, I'm guessing, but next year. That if the offensive in Kursk is successful, it will be seen to have forestalled that from a military point of view. But from a political point of view, it has already succeeded. It's given the sense that the Ukrainians, can achieve success. They can actually worry the Russians, so much as to cross the Russian border and hold now for 4 weeks. And I'm very surprised that they're still holding it after 4 weeks, but hold a chunk of territory, which is not getting any smaller and in some respects is getting bigger. And they calculated that they would catch the Russians flat-footed, which they have. And they've shown that the Russians can be beaten tactically on the ground. And so they've got the political benefit from putting Putin under some stress. And undoubtedly, although he doesn't say much about this, and he still won't acknowledge that Russian territory has been invaded, he's still calling it a sort of a counter-terrorist operation. But I think most people in Russia just don't believe that. And they realize, I think, that he is being very disingenuous in trying to, wriggle out of this invasion of Russian territory. So the Ukrainians have got the political benefit of that. And they've also got the benefit of showing to their Western backers that they're not just losing slowly, because the story of the war since their failed offensive last year is that they're doing very well. They're very gallant. They're brave, but they're losing slowly against this overwhelming Russian steamroller. And so they've reverse that narrative. And of course, that is designed as well to play into the American elections and to show certainly the Democrats and quite a lot of the Republicans that Ukraine is well worth backing for in the new administration, whether that's now a Kamala Harris administration or a Donald Trump administration.
President, you mentioned President Putin's sort of reaction or lack of, or almost shoulder shrugging over the offensive in the Kursk Oblast. They do seem to have gone, Russian forces, all out in the push towards Pokrovsk. Is there a risk of Russian forces overextending there?
Yes, there is. Their losses can't be sustained in Pokrovsk for too long. It may be that they will take Pokrovsk, and in any case, once they're within artillery range, which they more or less are now, they'll do to Pokrovsk what they did to Mariupol and Severodonetsk and Avdiivka and Bakhmut, that they'll shell it. They will reduce it to rubble and then take control of the rubble. That's the way they do it. And so Pokrovsk is in danger that is now the outcome. Pokrovsk was a city of about 60, 70,000 people. There now, it's said there are about 25,000 people still there. One imagines that they will get out pretty quickly. And what will be left will be the rubble as from the eastern part of the city spreading to the center and the west as the Russians move closer. That would seem to be the next stage in this process. But the Russians can overextend themselves. And indeed, if the Ukrainians can summon up more forces, that they have an opportunity as well to chop Russian forces off as they move towards Pokrovsk. So they're not out of options at all. So tactically, the Ukrainians, can do more in Kursk. They're almost goading the Russians in Kursk to come and make a proper fight of it. But the Russians are moving in troops from all over the place, but not from the south. But because of that, the Russians have got not much of an operational reserve in the south. And if the Ukrainians can summon up some more forces from somewhere, they might actually be able to damage Russian forces around Pokrovsk. But that hasn't happened yet. We don't know. But I have to say, with all of this, it's not entirely clear that the Ukrainians have a united military strategy. They are pushing in Kursk for reasons that we've talked about. They're defending in Pokrovsk and probably not going to be successful in the longer run. They're holding in other areas, they're pressurising Crimea and still attacking refineries in Russia, in the Rostov region, and so on. It's hard from the outside to see a unified strategy from all of this, other than to, as it would keep tweaking the tail of the Russian military to keep showing that the Russian military are beatable. I think that's probably as far as the strategy goes at the moment.
So is there a way of pulling that strategy together from those different ways that Ukraine is fighting this war that you just mentioned?
Well, they could if they had a lot more equipment, and they need a lot more ammunition. They need a lot more air defense ammunition, missiles for anti-air missiles, and they need more of everything. And particularly, they need to hold the present strategy, such as it is, in place long enough to mobilize more troops. I mean, they are getting more troops. I mean, they're doubling the number of troops who are being sent to training units because of changes in the mobilization law and tighter mobilization. And President Zelensky is suffering because of that politically, because it's not popular. But he is insisting that Ukraine must mobilize fully for this war, and that's understandable because they're fighting for their lives. So if the Ukrainians can hold on, then the pendulum will, I think, begin to turn back to them, at least in numbers, at some point over the winter and the spring. So there is a sort of there may be an inner coherence to this, but it's hard to see when their troops are so heavily stretched around the whole of the front what they can get out of this. If they can't make the Kursk operation work by saving Pokrovsk, then they may stay in Kursk for a long time, and Putin still won't react. And I find that very odd. I mean, Putin's argument is threadbare. What he says, very, very peculiar. He said, look, there are 5 oblasts, regions in Ukraine, which are Russian territory. He claims Luhansk and Donetsk and Zaporizhia and Kherson and Crimea. He said, well, we're already fighting in these 5 sovereign areas of Russia. So fighting in Kursk is just fighting in a 6th sovereign area of Russia. They're all sovereign areas of Russia. Now, that is a sort of strangely logical argument if you accept that he is a natural imperialist. Everywhere he claims belongs to him because he claims it. But I'm not sure that the Russian people or the Russian elite will go along with that. They know the difference between Luhansk and Donetsk and Crimea and Kursk, for heaven's sake. And they know the difference between the symbolic importance of Kursk in the Second World War. It has the same status as Stalingrad in the national memory. They know the difference between that and Zaporizhia, for heaven's sake.
Indeed. You mentioned just now that President Zelensky is not very popular politically at home. The politics in Ukraine at the moment are unpredictable. The spree of high-level resignations at the top level there, including Dmytro Kuleba, Ukraine's top foreign diplomat. Why now? What has triggered this?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, Kuleba has been rumoured to be stepping down for some time, or that Zelensky felt that he needed to replace him for a while. I don't think it's because of any particular lack of performance, but I mean, Kuleba himself maybe getting very tired. I mean, he may be exhausted, and he hasn't made a great success of getting more weapon systems, going around the chancelleries of Europe and in the United States and really persuading them of Ukraine's case any more than the president could. So it may be that he's exhausted what he can do as a sort of a vibrant force for Ukrainian nationalism. That's possible. I'm in a way, I'm not as worried about that from Ukraine's point of view as I am of the stepping down of Kamyshin, Alexander Kamyshin. And Kamyshin was the man who used to run Ukrainian railways very, very efficiently, even after the war started. And Kamyshin was transferred from doing the railways to being the Minister for Strategic Industries, which is basically the war economy, creating war production. And he's very dynamic, very well respected, extremely effective. I always say he has a very strange hairstyle. It's sort of a cross between a Mohican and a punk hairstyle. I always think he looks like something out of an ABBA tribute band. And he's got a fierce look, but he's very effective. And he has stepped down from being Minister for Strategic Industries. And he said, or made a statement attributed to him, he will still have a role, but he's not quite sure what it is. And if anything, I would be expecting this man to be promoted. But if he's been sidelined in some way, that is worrying, because that sort of suggests that Zelensky is prioritizing loyalty maybe over ability. I hope not. And I hope there is something very important for Kamyshin to do, because I rate him very highly. But if you look at the other resignations, I mean, 2 deputy prime ministers, one responsible for European affairs and one responsible for NATO issues, Justice Minister, the Environmental Minister, the State Property Fund Manager, a presidential aide. So 8 key people have all resigned. And that's, in one sense, that's not unusual, in that any president is entitled to refresh his team. But he may be going forward now into a difficult winter. He may be looking towards elections next year, because he can't keep postponing them. And so, and he has to bolster his domestic popularity, which is slipping. And he has to have a team around him who are loyal, because he's going to have to take some very unpopular decisions during the winter. So you can see a sort of the reason behind all of this, but undoubtedly it's an unsettling time for the capital of a country that's at war.
Yeah, we're talking late Thursday morning UK time, and this reshuffle, this reassigning of positions is ongoing. There will be more information coming out probably by the time this is published. But what I was just interested to ask you whether you think any of this has anything or tells us anything about the direction in which President Zelensky sees the war going, particularly ahead of his trip to meet President Biden to present his victory plan.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's got to be able to show the Americans that he has a route to a settlement, which would be a victory, in the sense that it would be a defeat for Putin's adventure, certainly since February 2022, this latest second Russia-Ukrainian war, as I would call it. So he has to be able to go to Washington saying, look, I've got a team of ministers who are really effective. They're very enthusiastic. They're loyal to me. And I mean, the Americans take a great interest in the Ukrainian government. They've got advisors in Kiev all the time. The Americans, it's an open secret. The Americans give advice to Zelensky, which he doesn't always take, as to who he should use in this or that role, because he always has to keep convincing the Americans that the aid that they're getting is not dribbling away in local corruption. And there's always a degree of corruption. I mean, Ukraine was a very corrupt society until Zelensky became president. And partly he was elected as president in 2019 because people were so completely and utterly fed up with Ukrainian corruption. It was classic post-Soviet corruption. After 50, 60 years of Soviet control as part of the Soviet Union, corruption was so endemic in society, it takes a whole generation to work it out. And so part of his reshuffle is also, I think, to convince the United States that he's on board with reforming the government as well as fighting the war, because both are the same. He has to keep convincing the United States, above all countries, that Ukraine is a worthwhile case, not just in natural justice terms, but a viable government for the future that can see off the Russians in the next year or two and establish itself as a functioning state with American help and support going forward. And that's a message I think he will try to push very strongly when he's in Washington.
And on the subject of weapons, Washington and Kyiv are reported to be close to an agreement whereby the US would give them the joint air-to-surface standoff missiles with a range of 230 miles. I mean, it doesn't mean they'd actually be allowed to use them to strike deep into Russia. So how significant would that be if they got them? And also for the foreign minister, the Russian foreign minister, to actually comment about this and warn about not crossing red lines must mean perhaps the Russians really are a little bit worried about this.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of Russian reactions, they always say that. I mean, every time the backers of Ukraine come up to a threshold, the Russians threaten dire consequences, and they always make nuclear threats. They say it every time, and they're doing their worst in Ukraine, so it probably won't make that much difference. Which is not to say we've got to be reckless about this, but they are important. These JASMs, as they're called, if they are delivered to Ukraine, certainly they'll give them, more missiles that they can use more flexibly. Certainly in Crimea, which is Ukrainian territory. They're free to use it there, in Luhansk and Donetsk. But also, I think the issue is not so much the range of the missiles, which would stretch deep into Russia, but it would have to be be surrounded by an agreement that the Ukrainians would only use them against absolutely strictly military targets, and no dual targets or targets that could be interpreted either way. And that's what I'm sure the Ukrainians are saying to the Americans is, look, we just want to go after the air bases. We want to go after the air bases that are sending off these aircraft with glide bombs that are doing so much damage, not just to our front lines, but to our civilians as well. And if the Americans are prepared to do that, that in itself won't win the war for Ukraine, but it will certainly give them some leverage in the present offensives in this dynamic phase that we're in. But the other important thing it will do, it'll put pressure on the European allies to actually match it, in particular for Germany to give Taurus missiles, which they so far have resolutely refused to do, or at least the Chancellor has, or the members of the German government are more ambiguous about that. But it'll put pressure on them, and I think it would release the British to offer Storm Shadow to operate inside Russia, which it is widely believed the government wants to do, but feels it can't at the moment because it hasn't got the Americans on board because of American involvement, which I won't go into anymore, about Storm Shadow's use. It's not the missile itself, it's the way that they're used requires some American help. And so if the JASMs were provided, I think other things would then become more plausible for the Ukrainians. And together, they could make a difference. But again, it would take the war to a new level of escalation, because the Russians would then really start to feel the effects of it on their military air bases deep inside Russia.
In the meantime, you've written and said before that neither side in this war expects a decision on the battlefield this year. They're both playing for a big push in the ground war for 2025. To be able to do that, what would each have to do in the coming months?
Well, Ukraine has got to gear up more effectively than it has so far. Its own war industries, and it is doing that, and it needs more time, particularly in the electronic areas and using drones and adapting drones and modern rocket artillery, and it needs more aid from the Western nations. So it just needs more of everything. And over the winter, if it can demonstrate that it's got a plausible strategy for next year, then it may get them. The Russians are coming towards a sort of peak production. I mean, although they've got lots of plans for much expanded armed forces and much bigger industry, when you look at their production levels and indeed their recruitment levels, they're dropping all the time. I mean, they're losing more men per day than they're recruiting per day. So they're recruiting fewer than 1,000 men per day, even at very, very high rates of pay around the world. They'll take troops from any country, more or less, and troops from any part of Russia. But they're recruiting rather fewer than 1,000 a day, and they're losing 1,000 a day. So the Russians are coming towards a sort of peak production level, and they may struggle after the end of the year to actually maintain these levels of involvement. So they need somehow as well, if they're going to run a spring offensive, to build up more forces than we think they're likely to have in February or March.
We've talked before, Mike, about the context of the war in the changing geopolitical landscape. And there are varying reports in recent days about the stage at which NATO member Turkey is in joining BRICS, the group of emerging markets led by Russia and China. What do you think is going on here? And what would it mean if it did join?
Well, Turkey says that it has a right to join any other organisations, and that BRICS is not a competitor to NATO, which it isn't. It's like a G7. It's more of a snub to the G7 than it is to NATO. But undoubtedly, Erdogan of Turkey is always testing the limits of the loyalty of the Western allies, and Turkey is not going to get thrown out of NATO. Although you'd wonder what a state has got to do to be thrown out of the alliance. There is no procedure for it. But what does happen is that the NATO alliance increasingly works without thinking about Turkey or without regarding Turkey as an effective ally. Now, Western countries, they need Turkey for all sorts of things, and there are common interests. But in a way, that the collective interest of NATO is getting further away from Turkey's own interpretation of its national interest. And so I think there's a sort of a divergence will continue for as long as Erdogan is in power.
And Mike, I mentioned at the beginning your new book on Great British Commanders. Just interested from the research that you've done, if you were to choose just one of them for their analysis on this war in Ukraine at the moment, who would you talk to and what would you want to hear or know?
Well, the person you'd be tempted to talk to would be Montgomery, who had a great sense of strategic reality. But the problem with Montgomery is that he had no sense of political practicality. And so he would come up with a strategy that made perfect sense on paper and couldn't be implemented politically. If I had to go to somebody who could really do it, I'd go to Marshal Slim, who created the 14th Army and fought the most successful campaign of the 20th century for any British forces. The 14th was the last and greatest of the imperial armies, and it was the most successful British army in British 20th century history. And he created it, he directed it, and he had a sense. He would be able to say to the Ukrainians, this is how we'll outflank the Russians. This is what we'll do to surprise them. This is what we'll do to keep them off balance. And this is what we'll do to protect as many of our own troops as we possibly can. He was very, very clever at using his forces with minimum losses in order to create maximum problems for the opposition. So if I could give them anybody, I'd give them Bill Slim in 1944.
Professor Michael Clarke, great to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.